And hello, welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. I am quite excited about this show. There was quite a lot of excitement in the pregame as we were getting all set up, so this is going to be a ton of fun. I'm John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET community team. And today we have with us Safia, Abdalla, David, Fowler, and Damian Edwards. Can you folks introduce yourselves very quickly for people who are new?
I'm David. I'm new here. I'm new here. I'm a developer on ASP.NET Core. Remember that? Developer, architect, person. What do y'all do?
Oh, I'm hi, I'm Damian, and I'm a PM architect on ASP.NET Core, which is just a title that we made up, basically.
I'm Safia, and I am actually a developer on ASP.NET Core. Yeah.
Shade.
Type on my keyboard a lot.
Very nice. All right. Well, today is exciting because by popular demand, today we're going to be talking about how people actually contribute to ASP.NET Core, and we're going to talk through what people on the team do, how you set up a computer. For instance, in the hypothetical case of if you destroy your computer, how you rebuild that computer and get it set up. Like maybe David would have some ideas on that.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's something that David might be able to talk about with some recent experience. I'm not sure.
My computer's still working, actually.
Nice. Yeah, so we'll talk through that workflow. And but first, as always, because we do, I'm going to start with some community links. I still need to get that song set up.
Where's the audio?
John Loves Community.
John Loves Community.
There it is. There it is. Okay. I'm sharing them here. Here's how I share. These are all the links that we are sharing today. Okay, cool. Wonderful. And I'll hide this. Okay, here we go. First of all, a couple on Microsoft Graph. So this is from Damian Bowden, and he's talking through some cool stuff with creating Teams links from an ASP.NET Core application. So as he always does, this post is complete with a lot of code. He talks through all the configuration. One of the neat things here is when you're set up using, when you're hosting in Azure and you're using Microsoft Identity Web, some of the graph things just kind of automatically work. So here he talks through kind of the setup with Graph, and he talks about, the packages to bring in and stuff. And then there's decent amount of code. You have to configure all the GUIDs and make sure that's all happy. But once you're there, you can actually just programmatically go through and configure a meeting. So this looks pretty neat. I can see setting up some internal things and bombarding you all with meeting requests on Teams. And the cool ending result is this here. So here he's got a cool, form, and then go through and create the Teams meeting. So it's pretty neat.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's, like there's always like a hump with me for Graph. Like there's a decent amount of like, you got to set everything up. You got to read some docs. Yep.
Yeah.
But then once you got it configured, you're like, whoa, it actually worked. That's amazing. And there is some pretty cool stuff going on with Azure recently as far as authentication between services. More and more things just kind of automatically authenticate, which is pretty nice. So, all right, here's another one. This is from Justin Yu, and this is using Microsoft Graph from Blazor, WebAssembly, and Azure Static Web Apps. So the neat thing there is this is a static web app. This could be hosted. It's just static application. Could be in GitHub Pages or Cloudflare or whatever. So here, this is talking about handling all the authentication, doing all the same sort of configuration things, and configuring across their Graph. So, and of course, like the magic stuff that makes this work again is the AAD configuration. That's where kind of like, so your application just needs to say, talk to Graph, and it kind of handles that stuff. So anyways, there's that. Okay, here's a few cool ones. Andrew Locke is doing a walkthrough on new things in .NET 6. And so the first one here is Configuration Manager.
John, I just have to jump in. So people are complaining they can't see Fowler in the bottom left of the screen because
I know.
Very nice.
Because that link, I saw it and I was like, this is crazy.
There it is.
It's frustrating. I got to tell you. Yeah, those things, I wish it's like we don't have control. This is one of the few things we don't have control of with SteamYard. And I said SteamYard, I mean StreamYard. But they should automatically move stuff when you got a banner. So, but yeah. Now we can see the guy at the bottom. It's much better. Yeah. And one neat thing though that I can do is I can move myself around, which is kind of fun.
Oh.
It's like, shoo, shoo,
Cheat
shoo.
code.
Yep. There's no key code. That's another problem, but it still all works. Okay, so Configuration Manager. So here, Andrew talks through how Configuration Manager works and comparing it to Configuration Builder. So honestly, this one, any thoughts on this? Any kind of high-level TLDR on Configuration Manager? Because
yeah, so we added this because of the new hosting model in .NET 6. And the intent was we needed something that could both read and add config sources and read config sources as they were being built. And it kind of merges being able to read and mutate config at the same time. There are some providers like Key Vault who need a connection string from config to configure itself for more configuration. And this helps that situation. So you can kind of put in the first, the connection to Key Vault can come from configuration from your environment variables. And then you can add more config via Key Vault on the same builder. Before you had to build the configuration halfway and you kind of had a half built config. This one does the same thing, but it makes it a more first-class API and it's cheaper to do so.
Okay, that totally makes sense. I've definitely run into that with some things where it's like the way you configure. Yeah, you need the configuration to connect to one thing before you can connect to the next.
It's inception. So you build the configuration before you're done building the configuration to build the configuration so you can finish it. Awesome.
Okay. Cool. This totally makes sense. So with that background in mind, I will reread this. And there now it's clear what this is saying. I didn't connect that. So very cool. So that is number one. And I'm happy there's a series here. Here he's also looking at Web Application Builder and comparing that to generic host. So again, this is one I pulled up this morning. These are on my reading list, and I have not read through this in depth.
This is a good one.
Yeah. Okay. Give me the TLDR
So
again here.
it's basically comparing what we did from ASP.NET Core 1.0 to now, and all the changes from having the host, having your app have all the configuration, to having these helper methods, to adding the generic host in 3.x and 5.x, and then now the new host. It's funny. I guess we kind of went in a circle where we had a ton of code, then less code, then less code, but still too much code, and then we have like the least code, I think.
It's like we served you a deconstructed latte in the first phase. We gave you all and then it was like over time we were like, you know what? People are complaining that they have to make their own latte. Maybe we should just give you a latte at the end. But we did it from the right end, because I think we were so obsessed in the beginning that we didn't want to fall into the trap that retrospectively we felt we had fallen into with some other parts of ASP.NET, where as EDMs changed over time in the industry and people wanted more control over certain things or whatever it might be, we had a ball of mud in a lot of ways, and it was impossible to pull that ball of mud apart back into like water and dirt and whatever else you needed with ASP.NET. And so we really like worked incredibly hard to create all these beautiful layers and have like things depend on each other in the right order. And this is basically what we talked about, I think, with Stefan, John, on the show. So it'd be good for folks to read this who perhaps don't like sitting through an hour of me talking. This goes through it with accuracy because it actually shows you the code rather than me just talking about it. So yeah, we did kind of come full circle, but in doing so, because we did it in the order we did, I think we ended up with a much better result than if we tried to do it up front.
And to Damian's credit, like I remember in .NET 2.1 and 2, he was adamant that we add the create default builder, because in 1.0 startup was insanely huge, right? Yeah. It was like every configurator was added, everything was explicit. We were like pay for play, everything has to be there in your face, and it got easier as time went by. And I think we're in a better place now because we actually did that whole end-to-end journey. So you can start from a full thing, clear things out, add more things. I think if you think about ASP.NET on full framework, you couldn't really turn things off super easily.
Right.
So I think the model we had where we started with nothing and then we had this kind of helper to add default things, that helped us we designed a system where you can actually start with defaults and then clear defaults, so you don't have to kind of have everything on by default the whole time.
Yeah. That was one of those rare cases where you and I, just like before the show today, where you and I did not agree at all. And
that never happened.
In ASP.NET Core 2, and you didn't agree so much with me that I literally had to write the code.
Yeah. I think I called it the Damian function. It
was the Damian function. And it was like you had the Fowler template, which was the empty web template.
Oh, yeah.
And this was the Damian function, the web host class, with the create default builder. And I wrote that class, including the first versions of map-get and whatnot. And as you said, we've kind of come full circle now. Yep. It just takes time sometimes.
Well, and one nice thing with this is that you see what people use and what connects with people too.
Exactly.
Right? Because you have a here's what I think and here's what looks nice in the code, and then you see the community like uses or doesn't use things or gets confused by things you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
And then be able to kind of iterate. So
it's a good point though. Like I think also at the beginning, we were kind of hesitant to try things and like give them to the community, put them in the product and then see how they go. Let them go out into the big, great world. Like you're kind of scared of making a mistake, right? We got millions of users and obviously a fairly major platform in our industry. And it took us a while to build up the courage in some ways, like the product courage and the institutional acceptance to say, we're going to try this. We have good reasoning, we believe, as to why we want to do it this way. We may not all agree on the team, but we agree that this is worth trying. And given the nature of the product now, where we can make changes and do so in a fairly safe way, modulo the normal things that are difficult to do in .NET, we do that from release to release. We will make changes that can be bold, if I might use that word, and potentially not land well with a bunch of folks initially, but we want to try that out. What's that?
Disruptive, you mean?
Yeah, I'm trying to choose my words carefully. And then if we decide ultimately that it really didn't work, we can change it back, right? We're not completely concrete. We can actually make changes and let things evolve. But I think if we don't do it that way, it's very difficult for us to innovate. It's very difficult for us to try things, just due to the nature of like how preview software works. It's very difficult to get people. And it's hard to A/B test with something like .NET, right? You can do it in Visual Studio. It's very hard to do it in .NET.
So there's some questions in the chat, and this is from a full framework point of view, but kind of this big fundamental thing is in previous with full framework, you had Web.config, which is an XML file, and it's very much you're just listing, here's what I want, but you really don't have control and you don't have logic to be able to get in and say, if I'm in development, then use this or whatever, right? So I think as David answered in the chat, but like Web.config, there are still occasional times where it's pulled in to configure IIS. But as far as the ASP.NET application, all the configuration happens in the builders, right? And I think this thing, even this code sample right here, as I remember, this is no longer required, right? This happens automatically now.
Yep, that's right.
Cool
So
stuff.
the IIS thing is interesting. So ASP.NET Core is a bit unique compared to other frameworks in that we love Windows. So our stack works with IIS by default. So even though you have this super lightweight function, that the create default builder thing, we still configure the hosting for IIS, for Castro, for other servers by default. So when you run this on IIS, it actually works out of the box without more configuration. I think the question is around before we had one config file, web.config, for both app configuration and for IIS configuration and for the framework itself. On ASP.NET Core, that config is split. So app configuration is from app settings or environment variables or other config sources that may be configured in the application. Web.config is purely for IIS configuration. So if you want to configure modules or handlers or any IIS specific setting, then you can use Web.config. But for other app settings level things, those go into the app settings JSON. And it's important because ASP.NET Core doesn't just run on IIS anymore. It runs on other servers. It can run on Linux, where you don't have IIS. So we didn't want the config coupled to that asset, right? When you publish an application, I believe you do get web.config by default in the output folder.
Not anymore. We changed it. So
we
changed it so that you do if you publish on Windows. So
I see.
If the RID runtime ID, either implied or specified, is Windows, we publish a web.config. It used to be true that no matter what you published for, we just gave you a web.config.
Yes.
We changed that very recently. I can't believe I don't know if it was on .NET 6 or 5, but I remember making that fix not that long ago. So now if you publish on Linux, you don't see this file in your output that has nothing to do with running on Linux.
Got it. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
Is that also true for the ASP.NET Core module? And skip it. Should be both.
Here's a couple on general streaming stuff. So Jürgen, who by the way had a really cool book that I'm still reading through on configuring ASP.NET 5 and a lot of like down deep kind of configuration stuff. But this is on async streaming using async enumerable. So that's really handy for streaming large amounts of data. And there's another recent post I featured that showed some kind of like benchmarks with this and showing specifically how this enables just streaming. It's nice because I've seen over time people have written things to do this sort of thing, and it's a lot of code, and here it's just kind of enabled. I've
always found the overload of the word streaming in .NET an unfortunate. Like every time I hear the word streaming in this context, I still think of like, oh, .NET streams. But outside of .NET, the word stream typically means this type. That's generically, oh, you're streaming data, right? I don't know. I've always found that unfortunate in our ecosystem that it's just an unfortunate kind of overload. Async enumerable supports streaming, but we have a stream that's like the foundation of everything in .NET.
Yeah.
With byte flow. But anyway.
Yeah, I agree.
And this feature is really interesting because it's very specific, right? People think it is server-sent events or some other kind of streaming. What it really is a very specific feature around you can stream arrays to the client. And if the client supports reading streams on the fly, so parsing a JSON array as an incoming stream and not as a big single array object, then you can actually stream on both sides, on client and server.
So there was a recent post that I featured that showed this using JSON LD, which is line delimited JSON. And that's what works with that, because then otherwise you need the entire JSON file to parse it, right?
Yeah,
right. JSON LD, you're able to do that. So this is pretty handy. One other neat thing I wanted to call out is that he's using GenFoo, which is just a pretty handy, like for mock data, it's really neat. It handles things like generating names, or you give it some general kind of information, it just will create as much mock data as you want. So it's been around for a while, but it's just very handy if you're like, I don't care, I just want 1,000 people with phone numbers, it'll just create those for you. So kind of neat. So this is a short one. This is on WebSocket per message compression in ASP.NET Core 6. And what he's talking about first is that he had first written something, he said, a hacky way to get this going himself, and he's happy that now it's just supported. So it talks about configuring that and then also overriding that for per message. So
this is actually a third-party contribution. Like,
oh, cool.
This whole thing was done by someone, I can't remember the name now, but by a contributor.
Wow.
And it was actually a really hard thing to implement. And I think we actually had to make changes to deflate the actual deflate algorithm, which I think we get from Intel or something. Anyway, yeah, that the whole thing had to change to make it work.
Wow,
efficiently. It was impressive, super impressive feature being added.
So, what's the high level? Why would you want per message compression?
It's part of the WebSocket spec. You can do per message compression. And the reason it's per message is because there's a security issue with compression and HTTPS. So you don't want to compress messages that have secrets in them because of the crime and breach. I think are the two names.
Isn't it? You don't want to encrypt things that have user echoed compress things that have user data in them, so that the client can affect the compressed data. Because then over time you can observe.
It's the same problem as HTTPS.
Yeah.
It's the same issues.
Same issue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why I think in .NET 5 or maybe 3.1, Core 1, we added a new feature in the features collection to indicate whether you want to enable compression for the compression middleware over HTTPS at the request level. So because it's off by default because of these issues. But you can say, no, I know, for example, this view has no data in it, no text whatsoever that is echoing back something the user could have typed in, and thus it's okay to enable compression. But you kind of have to do that manually. Right. We don't have a declaration for it. You can't just say, like, make this whole folder like that. But no one has asked for it, so we haven't bothered. There's a lot of ways we could make it better, but no one has asked. So,
got it. Okay, cool. Let me see. This is funny because there's a question in the chat. Is it possible to upgrade from something to something? And David says you can upgrade anything to anything. As part of that, here's his migration guide. So, David, apologies. I just grabbed a few of your gists that you have tweeted recently.
Gists are awesome.
Yeah. So this is this whole kind of migration walkthrough.
Yeah.
We always have, like, there's official docs, which are maintained and argued over by content editors and things. Yep. And but as you're going, you're just kind of writing this up. So these are kind of I would call these like your notes as you're going through, right?
So essentially, we have to generate content for doc writers to kind of put into the docs format and overall docs page. So this is essentially what I give the docs team. So
cool.
This is the actual content we want to put in the migration guide for ASP.NET 6, ASP.NET Core 6. So, and this is just like, how do we get all the data in one place so we can actually say, like, here's the content, let's figure out how to actually put it into the real document as official and whatever.
We have to thank Safia. Safia called you out completely. Yeah. And then you felt totally guilty.
Triggered me.
And you went off and
triggered me.
Brain dump. And it's incredibly well done too. My brain dumps have no formatting. They're literally just like no carriage returns. I just keep typing until I fall over. You actually put effort, because I get analysis paralysis whenever I try and do stuff like this these days. But you did very well. I was very
Once
impressed.
you start,
yeah,
it's easy. The hardest part is starting it, and then structure, and then like you have to figure out where to put things, and that's the worst part.
So now I got to look, because here here's what's in the doc. So I'm sure these are like.
So look at the date at the top of that, and then how long ago was this doc written? Was it is it March?
March.
Yeah, so we haven't updated the migration guide to 6 since March, which is obviously way behind, and so we'll get that updated hopefully by the RC2 release, which is another few weeks away.
And it says preview too. Oh, I see it.
People may not think about this, but this is there is a lot going on right now at Microsoft as the features kind of harden, and like the features aren't changing now, but the tooling, the docs, the guidance, like we're doing all this work for Microsoft Learn, going through and reviewing things, and how are we going to update, and so it also reflects what's in the templates, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of work that goes into all this stuff to try and ship along with.
And we made some pretty impactful changes this release. The templates and actually leveraging some of the language features. There were some impactful language features this release, and then we actually used them in the templates along with language features from C#9 and C#8 that we hadn't sort of done the work to bring the content forward. And so this is, in a way, one of those catch-up releases, I guess, where, as you said, whether it's templates or docs or learn material or whatever it might be, there's a bit of a backlog, honestly, and we hope to do a better job moving forward of keeping the stuff more modern. When we add features, we need to use them.
So as an example, here's the minimal APIs at a glance, and also there's tons of information here, and we've had several shows on this, and there's lots of blog posts, but a lot of the time it's great to just read some code, and so I appreciate this for being able to just kind of read through.
Yeah, my goal here was to basically remember when we learned to code on MSDN forever ago? We would literally just copy and paste code until it worked. So the goal was to give you snippets that you could just copy and paste for specific scenarios, HTTPS or routing or catch-all routes or like route binding. Because I think today our docs kind of give you the background and the foreground and the details all at once. So the goal here was to give you a kind of at a glance shot of all the features in one file. It's like, here's how you can use all the features, right? And the TLC at top can kind of help you jump around to like, do you want to know about routing, binding, the host, and it will just show you the things that you kind of have to know to get things going.
It's funny, like as one of the John and I, John, you might remember, we're the old people in the room. Back in the beginning of web development, when ASP was just version 1 and was still sort of not even out yet, there was a website called ASP101.com.
Oh yeah,
that's where I learned how to write ASP, and it was, as Fowler sort of saying, it was basically the front page was a table of links with columns for like what version or what database you're accessing or whatever, and then you would just like click, oh, I want to do this thing, whatever it might be. And you would click on it, and then there would be a code sample, and you would copy and paste it into your ASP page, and it would work, and you would move on with your job. And I must admit, like I think that style still resonates a lot. It's so valuable just to have this one long page or one TOC where you can just like Control F in the browser, search in one search term that you're looking for, like connection string or whatever. Yeah, that was the other one, connection strings. There was a website dedicated to getting connection strings. If anyone remember, it's probably still around. And you'd pick your database and it would give you the connection string format, and you'd paste that into your RDO or ADO or ADO.NET code, and then you could connect to your database. I still remember those sites, and like that's how I learned to code, like in the beginning of the internet, basically, was on those things.
Connectionstrings.com.
Yep. I think it was awesome.
What?
When someone from your internal, I was an internal dev back then, they said, can you make this thing connect to my Excel spreadsheet? And you're like, I guess. Let me go and find the connection string format to do that.
Well, and so like, of course, there's like here, this is still here, by the way. So, but there's tons of different things, right? There's all DB2 or text file or Oracle, Of course, the old one was Access, right?
The
this
Jet
is going to bring
engine.
back memories here. Ole BB.
Or connecting to Exchange 4.0. Like I remember all that there. Anyway, we should move on to like something valuable. This is very valuable, but we always, whenever we're on, we just keep talking, John.
Kind of wander, yeah. Well, so I just including these mostly for reference, but these are released last week right after our stand-up. So this is the overall .NET release post, and then here is the whoops, I got that twice. Wonderful. Here, let's go back and he also links over to the ASP.NET one, which is here. So we covered a lot of these because we did a Blazor stand-up last week, and a lot of these are Blazor specific features, but a lot aren't, right? So there are things in templates, minimal APIs. This was where I read also about the default, I believe, the developer exception page being listed. So a lot of other stuff. Also, I love seeing, and we've done some shows on this recently, but things just as far as logging and traceability, all this kind of stuff that's kind of under the hood and doesn't get, it's not like, whoa, check it out, but it's really useful as you're developing apps. So, yeah. So long post, and we've already gone kind of long on community links. So I will stop talking and turn it over to you folks.
All right. I have a machine set up. I actually managed to get my remote desktop working to my other machine. And so I'm going to share my screen. Yes. Let me find the right screen. It's that one. Okay. Let me know when it's
there.
Excellent. Okay. I will zoom into things as I can. This is 4K remote desktop. It's all stuff going on here. So I will zoom in browsers and whatnot as we go. What I wanted to do was initially was quickly walk through the steps that someone needs to do to clone the ASP.NET Core repo and get it to build, if as a step towards either contributing or perhaps just trying to learn more about how the code works and step through it, or even fork it and make a different version of one of the assemblies for your own purposes. So the first thing we're going to look at is basically there are some docs that help you walk through this. I believe Safia had a lot to do with getting these docs updated and functional. And I leveraged these docs when I had to do this myself a few months ago when I started working on a few things again. So if you go into the docs folder at the ASP.NET Core repo, you'll see that there is a build from source MD file right here. And if I click on that, you'll get this pretty good markdown file that walks you through a whole bunch of the steps involved. It is quite long. And so this is not, unfortunately, one of those repos yet where you can just walk up, clone, and then type build.cmd and you're off to the races. I wish it were that easy, but the product is quite complex. Some of the complexities, just off the top of my head, we have native code, to do with IIS and the ASP.NET Core module that we talked about before, which then flows into other dependencies that we have, so that you need to have some C++ tools installed. We have Java code because we have a Java client for SignalR, so that shows up. We have a whole bunch of web client stuff, so Node and TypeScript and those type of tool chains also show up as well. But the rest of the code is mostly just managed code. The vast majority of it is C#. But then there's a whole bunch of custom stuff as well. So these they don't look like your typical .NET projects. There's a lot of customization that's gone on with regards to like where the assets get produced. They don't go into a bin folder. They go into a central location underneath the repo path. Artifacts. We don't use the installed version of .NET Core or .NET. Like it is a hive, a private hive that is installed underneath the repo path, and you have to activate that hive when you're in there in order for things to work correctly. And then depending on what subsystem of ASP.NET you're particularly interested in, there may be quirks or caveats for those. Like templates, for example, have their own set of constructs and configuration and flows and helper scripts and stuff as well. And there's another README to kind of get you going with that. So I want to at least get through kind of the beginning and see if we can get a successful build of the repo in this show. And then we can talk about and answer questions as we go along. So as I said, step 0, like getting started, you're going to need Git. And I already have Git on here. And it talks about some of the, links you to the basics of forking and contributing on GitHub. If it's your first time on GitHub, then there's kind of a flow associated with working with people's repos on GitHub and then contributing back. Shall I fork? I probably shouldn't I? I should probably do a fork and do this properly.
Yep.
Yeah, we
Okay.
recommend forking.
Okay, so I'm going to hit the big fork button, and I'm going to fork it into my account. It says it should only take a few seconds.
Ooh, challenge accepted. See
All
how
right,
it goes.
so that happens. There it is. Damian Edwards, ASP.NET Core. It's my personal version of ASP.NET Core. I like GitHub for desktop. So GitHub Desktop is a pretty cool. So I'm going to use it here. So I'm going to say
the UI.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Jeez.
Beautiful. So the VS Code UI is really good as well. The GitHub tools for VS Code are nice. Once you get to the point of doing like pull requests and all that sort of stuff, it's just really nice. It's a very nice way of seeing all the stuff that's in your machine. And it automatically like pings in the background, so it knows when there are incoming changes, and it has a fairly good rebase UI and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So and it makes it very simple to squash commits locally. You can literally just like, control click a bunch of commits and say squash, which is very nice, and also for cherry picking. So there's like lots of different visual tools for Git, but I kind of like this one. Someone telling me to move to dark mode. I explicitly didn't use dark mode for this thing because I was presenting, but that's okay. So let's see if I can find my fork. I might have to refresh because I just created it. And I'm not going to clone to this location because who on earth puts stuff in the default location? I don't. And I don't want to do that. Oh, it's refreshing. It's taking a very long time. There it is. Beautiful. So I'm going to clone it into my local path. And I do have very fast internet here. So fingers crossed, we will not be spending a lot of time waiting for things, which is good. Cloning. How big is the repo? It's pretty big, right?
It is pretty big. We've got quite a few sub-modules in it. There's like 3 sub-modules that we pull in.
Right.
Obviously, lots of sources. I'm actually impressed with how fast yours did it. I was cloning mine earlier, and because I have the stream running, it took maybe about like 3 minutes, which is
okay. Yeah, I'm lucky enough to have gigabit here, and it's pretty good gigabit. Like it's actually gigabit, which is nice. So
I can't say the same for my gigabit, but yes, lucky you.
Sorry.
I was like, I refuse to do anything while streaming. It's gonna be so slow.
That's fair. So, and again, I optimized my setup here for this show. So like I am currently on my work desktop, which is like an 8th gen Intel 8700. It's not like a beast or anything, but it's running 3 screens. But this is all running on my personal desktop, which is off camera, which is I built this year, and it's like incredibly powerful. Like if I just show you, like I have a lot of cores and I have 64 gig of memory. Like it's a pretty good machine, and it's an incredibly fast hard drive. So hopefully this will be the fastest you can possibly do it, and we won't have to wait for things. This is something else that's nice about GitHub Desktop is like it actually asks you when you fork, do you want to set this up for personal, like sending back to the parent, or are you just going to use it for your own purposes? So if I do this, I think it'll actually do like set up the downstream and the origin, all that sort of stuff for you, aliases correctly. We'll see, because it's been a while since I've actually forked anything. All right, so I've got it here now. If I go to the command line, I see ASP.NET Core. There's my ASP.NET Core. Beautiful. So if we have a quick look at the folder structure here, it might actually be easier to look at it on the browser. All right. As I said before, we've got the docs, which is going to be a place you'll go for some of those markdown files and whatnot. There's this eng folder, which you'll need to kind of get familiar with as well, because this is where a bunch of the scripts are located in order to do stuff.
Let me pause you. Familiar with how? So like, to be honest, that folder is a clone from a thing called Arcade. Arcade is our build engineering, MS build goop. That a team, there's an entire team of engineers who write that stuff and maintain this stuff. This stuff is, I don't want to say it's immutable, but a lot of it is immutable and shouldn't be changed by a human.
That's right. So when I say familiar, you'll need to know it if you want to build the repo, because the build file is in this repo.
To be fair, I never look in here.
You may not, but you have a feel. And I think we'll get to that, is that each developer has a somewhat unique flow that they use. But you at least need to build the repo once to get pretty much anything to work properly, because of interdependencies between parts of the repo. And Fowler's lying. Fowler's like, nope, we don't need to do that.
This thing.
Our reading files say to do this.
Yes, in
Fowler,
theory,
if you want to write new files for people to follow, I invite you to do so. But the docs tell people to do this.
Question here: does there's the dot shortcut that brings it up in the in-browser VS Code experience?
It's pretty good. Safia uses that, I know, and I use it for finding stuff. It's much better than sort of just search. So the dot experience, which is open it in
CodeSpaces,
right?
Yeah.
Is super used. Like if I hit dot now, I just hit dot. It's the first time I've ever done it on this fork, obviously, and it's done. It's open, right? And then I can say, hey, let's go and find the request delegate factory, which is a new type in this release. And then usually what I would do, and look at that, it's not working at all. Did I type it wrong?
No, it's pretty tiny.
Have the sources been loaded?
It may be taking a little longer. I'm going to enable local indexing just to force it. Because I do use this myself, mostly just for searching, rather than doing actual work. I don't know what it's like for, there you go. So now it's working. I don't know what it's like for doing actual work.
I can talk a little bit about that later, since I've been doing actual work in CodeSpaces.
Nice.
And have done some fun stuff with the setup to make it a little bit easier and take off some of the repetitive tasks that you have to do when you're getting started on a new branch.
Got it. Nice. Okay. So let's jump back out, and I'll come back to here. I'll go back to my docs. I'll load it in a new tab because I just put up the CodeSpaces stuff. And let's see what the doc says to do next. I think I need to init my submodules is the next thing. Is that right?
Yep. And I think you want the build from source file for its docs, correct?
Docs, and I want build from source. We'll leave that open. So, yep, I've done my clone. And you can see here it says I have to do this. I always get this wrong. I always type submodule init -- update. I don't know why. I just always get this wrong when I do it. So let's do that first. As Safia said
use
before,
the UI, man.
What's that? I could use the
So does the Git UI not bring in submodules by default when you clone?
It doesn't seem to.
No recursive clone? Oh, man.
It doesn't seem to.
Ew.
Or maybe it does and I just didn't realize. Maybe. I don't know. But I've always had to do this on my machines. All right. So, and I have PoshGit enabled on this machine. So that's what's giving me the Git information in my terminal here. So if I do git status, I've got nothing. It's all up to date and it shows that I'm on main. So that's PoshGit. For those who don't know what it is, you can search for PoshGit to get this information in your PowerShell window. Okay, so next I want to build. I've got all the code. Let's go.
Zoom in on your screen a little bit. It's small.
Good?
Make it bigger.
Seriously?
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
I'm delayed.
Oh, you're delayed. Okay.
It looks good. Yeah.
That's good.
Cool. So in order to build, we have a few dependencies. And so if we go back to our machine here, it says that you want to set up your fork for remote changes. This is what GitHub Desktop did for me before automatically when I said I intend to use this fork to send changes back upstream. So I'm going to skip over this part, but this is the typical GitHub fork, set up the remote origins and whatnot for doing these things. I could do a branch. I'm not going to branch right now. I'm not going to actually make a change. So I'm just going to move forward to actually getting this thing to try and build. But you can easily create yourself a new branch. So on Windows, this is out of date. You actually need Visual Studio 2022 now. 2019 is not supported anymore because .NET 6 requires Visual Studio 22. I already have Visual Studio 2022 installed, which is the public preview. But as I mentioned before, there are certain workloads or components that you need to have enabled in Visual Studio in order to successfully able to build the ASP.NET Core repo. We have a script for that. And so this is another time you'll need to dive into the eng repo, I keep saying repo, folder to get Visual Studio set up. Now, if you already have an existing install, this should work. We made some changes to this recently. So let's go and find what happens when I try and actually run this. So I'm going to grab this stuff here and I'll paste it in and then I'll edit the bits. So I want to use the preview channel. And I have Enterprise installed. So I'm going to... it's wrapping.
You know what's interesting? There's actually a better way of doing this now.
There is?
In the installer, you can actually point to a manifest.
That's true. And the script supports this. I believe it has an argument for pointing at a manifest. Yeah.
We don't
you can,
document it though. That
It's
would be a
not
good thing to
documented,
update. Yeah.
and
Because
then
in
there's
.NET
also a
runtime-
version that you can type in here as well, but that's also not documented. But
Oh my
given we
gosh.
only really support 2022 now,
Painful.
doesn't really matter. If this doesn't work, there's also another argument you can pass to just point it directly at an install of Visual Studio. You literally give it the path to where it is, and then it will launch the installer to add the extra bits. So let's see what happens. I type this, it downloads a bootstrapper.
Nice.
All right. Okay. Yep. Cool. And then my hope is that this will point to the existing install, which it did. So there's the location. It says it there, 2022 preview. And I've already got stuff ticked because that's the stuff I've already got installed. If you are doing this on an install of Visual Studio where you don't currently have everything installed, then this, instead of saying close, would say like install. Okay. Because I've already got all the components. I've already done this step to avoid having to watch, download, and install Visual Studio 2022. But this, if you're on a machine without Visual Studio, or you're on a machine with Visual Studio and you don't have all the components, this is the step that you'll go through to get Visual Studio up to date with all the components that you need in order to build. So I'm golden. It says close, which means I've already got it all set up the way I want. Cool. So that's good. Let's go to the
Now,
next.
these are the steps for doing it with Visual Studio,
Yes.
full Visual Studio. You
That's
could
correct.
also do this using VS Code or
Yeah, you can. It's a little bit different. And Safia has more experience with that. AKA, I have no experience doing that. And Safia has done it with VS Code. You won't build everything, I believe, if you go that route. Is that right, Safia?
No, you only build the projects that you are editing. That's also the recommended workflow if you're working in Visual Studio. Basically, if you're working in SignalR, just build SignalR and its dependencies. Same for Blazor, minimal APIs. Try and avoid building the whole repo because then you're going to have a bad time. And unless you're Damian with a super beefy machine, your computer will probably hate you.
Never build the repo. That's
Yeah.
the real deal.
The doc does say you'll have to build it at least once, and the template doc says the same thing. Is that not true? Can you get away with never building the entire repo?
You generally can. So you'll have to restore the entire repo.
Right.
You don't necessarily have to build it. The templates are a little bit different because the dependencies that the templates have are so exhaustive, but that's only if you're working in the project templates.
Okay, so that makes sense because if you're in the templates, that's an app that kind of wants everything because you want the shared framework and all the rest of it. And so you kind of have to build the repo at least once to satisfy that dependency.
Yeah.
But you're saying if I'm in a subsystem like a specific middleware project or something, it really only depends on 12 other things and they are easy to build just with the managed tooling. Okay, gotcha.
Yes.
So you mentioned restore. I think that's the next step, right? Is I need to do my first restore. So if we look in the root, I believe there's a restore command, which there is. So I'm just going to do that. Now,
so I guess one thing is restore without any arguments. We'll restore the C++.
Yep.
We'll do NPM.
Yep.
Java.
Yep.
Native. So if you want to skip those,
it won't do Java if it installs.
It won't.
There's no Java.
Oh, good. That's fixed.
The purple message that came up said it detected Node on my system, and so it's going to do Node.
Oh, good.
But a lot of these
it will do an NPM install for all of the NPM projects which you want. And it will also install the local version of .NET that's defined in the global JSON. Yeah.
So that's the thing that we mentioned before is that, I have .NET installed. If I go to a new tab and say .NET version, I'll just zoom in on this a bit. I think this is the version that was released like today or yesterday. This is like the RC1 Prime, I think. This is 21463. And it came from Visual Studio. I didn't install it specifically. This is the one that just comes from the Visual Studio preview. We're not using that at all over here. We won't. I haven't got far enough yet. We're in the step of restoring, and so we're relying on the internet and then my machine to do some stuff. And then once this is finished, we'll be in a situation where hopefully we're almost ready to build. The restore step is something that if you're working on the repo frequently, you might need to do on occasion, right? Because the script, we update the version of .NET Core or the .NET SDK, for example, that the repo depends on. And if you don't run restore again, you might hit an error because there was a change that the code that you're working on now depends on from the SDK, right?
We basically use the newest version of .NET to build the newest version of the ASP.NET Core pretty often, and we update that version super often. So when you're deving in our repos, you end up having to run restore to get a new SDK pretty often.
Okay. Yeah, it's weekly. We do it
frequently.
Yes, we try and do it once a week, every Monday.
Okay. So I must admit, there's plenty of times where I just forget to do this step, and then I'll go make some changes. I'll run build, and it'll fail, and then I go, oh, let me first try to restore because I forgot to do that. And then a lot of the time, that is what I forgot to do. Okay, so we've got restore. Now the next thing is the thing that I often forget to do also, which is activating this terminal session with the version of .NET Core that just got installed in a local Hive. It didn't get installed, somewhere off on my machine. It got installed in here. So if I look up here, you'll see there's this .NET folder, and that's where we install this local SDK. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so I need to turn that on. And so I have to say .space and then type activate. And then you get this kind of .space / activate.ps1. And that, if you don't invoke it that way, I think it actually detects it. And it says, oi, you can't do that. You have to make sure you invoke it with this special leading dot, okay? This dot source thing. So if I do that, I get this nice purple message that says it's been activated. Now, if I type .NET version in here, you'll see I've actually got a different version. And see, silly me, I'm using main. What am I doing this in main for? There's no way this is going to work. This is on version 7.
That's what Seb said.
Sebastian said that earlier.
I literally haven't got main to work yet anywhere else since we moved to 7, but that's fine. We'll just continue through this.
So fun thing is, I never use activate personally.
How do you do it?
I path to the .NET folder
manually.
What?
The issue is activate changes your path, so I need to have 2 shells.
Just for this session, though.
Yeah. I prefer just having not doing that.
But you have tabbed terminals now. Why?
I don't. I personally. So 2 things. I use the IDE to run tests and stuff. So I'm hardly on the command line.
Okay.
To run tests and stuff. And when I do, I just path out to the folder and do .NET test or whatever.
Isn't there literally a script that launches VS for you with it?
Yeah, the start VS script.
Which is why you don't need to do activate.
Look at that. Start VS
activate.
CMD.
Activate isn't required to run start VS.
Okay, that's fair then. That's fair. So what Fowler is saying, to make sure I understand, is you can end up in a flow where you never have to activate because you're choosing not to just run .NET from the command line, or when you do, you're happy pathing to the specific instance.
Yep.
Figure out what works well for you.
Yeah, if you're in the IDE, for the most part, you pretty much can just run tests and dev from in VS, and you don't have to go to the command to run test, build, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am not going to start VS just yet. I'm going to get a build going first.
Sure.
Right, so now I've got restore. I think I'm in a situation where I can try and build.
The whole thing?
Yep.
We don't have a whole day.
It's going to take a few minutes.
We don't have a whole day.
I also don't have your crappy machine. All right. So if I go to the end,
we should start a timer.
Okay, we will. How about we do this?
John, can you put a timer on the screen?
That would be cool.
I think it's out default. There we go. All right. So I've wrapped it in measure command.
Yep. So
that we'll actually see, and because I've piped it to out default, we'll still see what it's doing. And then it'll give us the total time elapsed when we're finished. I'm going to not pass any arguments to build, and it's going to build everything except Java. Is that right? Let's find out.
I never use build. So
there are already bets going down.
Because you can do, well, I could do no restore because I just did restore, right?
So I believe if you run just the build command on its own, it should provide you with help instructions that outline all the different flags available. And then there's also a docs page for the build command that talks about.
I'm pretty sure I just run build. I think it just tries to build a default set now, doesn't it? Let's have a look.
Yeah, let's find out.
So here's an example. Build, no build native, no build manage may be necessary after switching branches. So it does take some arguments that you can give it to constrain what gets built. And I'm pretty sure that by default, it doesn't try and build Java, for example, because I don't have the JDM installed on this machine. So I'm going to just attempt to do this. And I'm going to pass no restore because I've already restored. And we'll see what happens. So, okay, so it says no default projects were specified. So building the managed and native parts. All right, so this is going to build everything. Yeah, all C# and all C++.
I'm building C++ is awfully slow, but our project is small,
On
so
your
you're
machine,
fine.
it might be awfully slow.
It's holy crap, that's huge. That's nuts.
I will probably hear my fan spin up from the other side of the office while this goes on.
Wow.
So we'll leave this going, and we come back to this when it finishes. And maybe there are some questions, or maybe Safia, do you want to show or talk about some of the stuff that you were talking about?
Yeah. So I think this is a good opportunity for me to talk a little bit about the CodeSpaces setup, which ties into the flow that I personally use for working in the ASP.NET Core repo, which is very command line and editor heavy. I use VS Code primarily. So yeah, why don't we give that a stab, and we'll see if I can get it all done before your thing finishes. It's just a challenge.
Okay.
All right.
So you code in the cloud, is what you're saying?
Yes, I do code in the cloud.
Okay, I don't see your desktop yet.
I'm about to start sharing it. It's coming to you.
Somebody else's cloud.
Cool. Okay, awesome. So first things first, in order to use what I'm about to share, you do have to have access to the CodeSpaces beta on GitHub. However, a lot of the principles that I'm going to cover, they're also going to apply if you're working with VS Code in the command line for both Windows, Mac, Linux. One of the great things I like about like the VS Code CLI combo is it's pretty platform agnostic. So you can kind of share the same instructions with everybody, and it should work for you regardless of whether you're on Windows or if you're like me and you develop primarily on Mac. Cool. So Damian was talking a little bit earlier about all of that fanciness that he had to do with cloning and restoring and yada, yada. I'm a busy person. I don't have that much time, and CodeSpaces gives me back that time. So what I actually want to do is I'm going to try and fix the docs page that Damian was just showing where we were referencing 2019 when that's not actually the case. And I'm going to actually do it on our release 6.0 branches to avoid that gnarly issue with the .NET 7 targets. So I've switched to the release 6.0 RC2 branch in the repo. Now, all I have to do is create a new branch off of this for my changes. And I usually do that in the GitHub UI. So if you go into GitHub and you switch branches, you can create a branch off of the branch that you're currently viewing. So let's do Safia /update docs.
By the way, my build's finished. My build just finished, just so everyone knows.
Are you kidding?
Nope.
Okay, you got to share your screen and show us.
Okay,
now
I got to prove it. Sorry, I had to interject because I'm like, yeah, it's
no, it's okay.
There you go. Oh, there we go. Share. Whoop. Coming up. There it is. So 2 minutes and 32 seconds. Build succeeded.
Way too long.
And you can see, I mean, you can't see the full history. It did peg the CPU at one point, but that was a full build from nothing. So obviously I paid for the restore at the beginning. It took about a minute to run restore, and then I did the build no restore. So at that point, it's all local. It's just power of the PC. So if you want me to build you a dev PC, just drop me a line, and I'm happy. I really enjoy
publish the hardware requirements. In the
I don't have anything to build anymore because I finished mine. Oh, Sebastian, just make me another lemon. That lemon tart you made me last time. That would be wonderful. And then I'll give $20 to charity. How about that? All right. Give the screen back.
Yeah.
All right. Switching over.
So unfortunately, I can't be as impressive as Damian and show a 2-minute build on my beefy machine, but I could show you using the cloud to write code. So now that I've created my new branch, again, I'm all in GitHub. I've used the GitHub UI to do everything. I'm going to navigate to this bright green button that beckons me so clearly. And there's, the usual tab where it shows you how to clone a repo locally, but then there's this CodeSpaces tab if you have that enabled. And what that allows you to do is you can create a new CodeSpace, which is a containerized development environment that's running on the cloud with a VS Code UI that's running locally. So when I click open in CodeSpaces, it's going to take a little bit of time to do some of its work. The work it's doing here, it's like pulling up a Docker image. Oh my gosh, no, this is so terrifying. I knew this was going to happen. I was like, I'm doing a live demo. Container build failed.
Of course.
No.
It's not even my fault. This is so terrifying. All right. Change of plans. Instead of creating a code space in a new branch, I'm going to actually show you one on an existing branch that I've been working in. So I had to fix a bug recently as part of RC2. We had a little bit of an issue parsing datetime and datetime offsets from rep parameters in minimal API. So I was working on getting a bug fix app for that. And I was actually using CodeSpaces to do it. So I've got the code space for that already running, and I'm going to open that up. I hope this one doesn't fail and it's not just like an issue with CodeSpaces in general right now.
Like, how often does how often do you see failures with CodeSpaces? What does that mean?
To be honest, I know no one's going to believe me, but this genuinely the first time it's happened in maybe a month.
Wow. Okay.
I'm just extremely unlucky. Yeah. Oh, well, sucks to be me. But cool. We'll keep going forward. So it's really great about CodeSpaces.
It's good to understand, right? And it's not, you're not running the service. It's not like you didn't crash anything.
And I'm pretty sure if you did run into something like that, like try it again. Those things are usually generally pretty transient. But one of the great things that this CodeSpaces setup will take care of is it will clone the repo with the submodules and mount it onto the container that this environment is running in. It's going to run the restore script. So when you pop into the CodeSpace, all of your projects have already been restored. The local version of .NET has already been installed and activated. So once you get into here, pretty much all you need to do is start coding and building. So my typical workflow usually consists of running some tests locally on the CLI. So let me go ahead and run this request delegate can process date times to UTC test. Now, no, all I'm going to do is I'm going to change directories. Let me zoom in a little bit. I'm going to change directories into my test directory. If you're not familiar with running tests in the CLI with .NET, you can use the .NET test command. And then there's a set of filters that you can pass in if you want to narrow to a particular class or method to test. So I can filter down to a class. That was my bad. I accidentally pressed enter instead of paste. Now what's going to happen here is it's going to run a re-restore if necessary for the projects that have been changed. It's going to build it, and then it's going to go ahead and run the actual test within my repo. And that's kind of the dev loop that I tend to have when I'm developing with CodeSpaces. I don't run the top level build command. I very rarely run even the build commands within specific projects. Usually I'm running .NET test, which is going to implicitly build the dependencies that I need. And then it's like a very test-driven development workflow that I try and go for. And when I'm not running actual unit tests, one of the things I'll do, and this is actually a pretty neat thing to show you, is I can actually try and run some samples. So let me go ahead and discard the changes I've made here. So in the repo, we have quite a few samples for things like minimal APIs. And we've got a minimal sample in the HTTP directory. So I'm going to change into that really quickly. I'm going to run this sample. And one of the cool things that you'll get to see here with the sample is that I can actually run this sample web application inside my container. And then I'll be able to visit it on a publicly available host name. So it's all like proxied out for you to be able to view. Now, one thing to note is you might have noticed that builds have been taking a little bit longer for me, certainly a lot longer than Damian's beefy machine. One thing to note is we are like running in containers here. So we definitely don't have, gosh, what was it? 16 cores, 64 gigabytes of RAM and what have you. But once your application is running, you can hit open in browser. And we'll actually be able to visit the app once it finishes loading. So I've hit a 404 because I don't have anything running on my index page, but I can go to hello, Safia, which is one of my endpoints, and I'll get back that plain text response from my sample application. So
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
This works.
Yes, it works.
Wow.
So I think that one of the key takeaways I have is really when people like try and go through the repo, I think the most important thing to know is clone with submodules and restore. And then when building can kind of be a scary thing, but I kind of try and focus on like the one thing that's going to help set me up for like a successful dev loop. So maybe it's running a sample, maybe it's running a unit test, maybe it's like making a change and like building a single project and seeing what like compiler errors I get. So try and hone in on like the smallest iteration that you can do, and then either use .NET Test, .NET Run, or .NET Build to like get your dev loop started.
Or VS.
Or VS. Sorry, this is VS Code also works on Windows.
Yep.
So yeah, this instructions I shared should work on everything. So yes, do try out CodeSpaces. So CodeSpaces is currently in beta right now. I believe it's out of beta for organizational users, but it is in a private beta for like just general everyday GitHub users. If you are in the beta, it is free to use. You do have a limit of 20 CodeSpaces. I haven't really had any issues with that. Usually what that means is every like 3 weeks or so, I'll go out and I'll prune my CodeSpaces and delete ones I haven't used in a while. That's the state of things for the beta. We'll see how like things move forward once it's out of beta for the general public.
Wow.
That's super impressive.
Yeah, that's really compelling.
I have to try that.
Whoa.
Yeah, it will.
Cool. So
Yeah, I don't know if we.
What's involved in setting that up for a repo to make sure it's got all the, dependencies and build tools and all the stuff you need?
Yeah, I can go ahead and talk about that real quick. Let's see. Oh, so before I talk about that, there is an issue, and I'm going to try and paste it in the private chat so that John can share it out with folks. If you have access to GitHub CodeSpaces and like any of this intrigued you and you want to help us make our GitHub CodeSpaces better, there's an issue we're using to get folks to like provide feedback and polish up our setup for GitHub CodeSpaces. So that should pop up as a banner soon.
Yeah, and it went out in the chat also.
Awesome. So the setup for GitHub CodeSpaces, it kind of relies on, I'm going to call it a standard. I'm not sure if that's the right term to use to describe it, but there's this dev container setup that you can use with VS Code to define a Docker-based configuration for a VS Code environment. What I mean by that is that whether you're running in CodeSpaces on the cloud or you're running VS Code locally and you've got the remote Docker extension where you have Docker installed locally and then like VS Code is running a server in your Docker locally, the same configuration will work for both. So what's really great about this dev container config is even if you don't have access to the CodeSpaces beta on GitHub, you could still use it locally on your Windows, Linux, what have you, if you have Docker installed and VS Code with the remote Docker extension. And the setup is basically a Docker file. Here we're using a standard image that Microsoft has provided for working with .NET. There's not a lot in the actual Docker file itself. This is something we're kind of working on iterating, but we're using a base image provided by Microsoft. It has a collection of dev containers for like .NET and C++ and Python and all those fun things. So our Docker file uses that. And then there's a JSON-based configuration where you can define the Docker file that you want to use to build. You can do things like outline a collection of extensions that should be installed by default when the user opens up the repo. VS Code is a very extensions-heavy platform. So, if you want a C# or Python or JavaScript functionality, you usually have to go out and install an extension. So we can define what extension should be installed by default. We can outline what things should be done when the container is created. So remember when I was telling you earlier about how I magically get my repo cloned and I get my my projects restored and everything at the beginning? This all happens because we have this container creation script that runs post the container being created, but before we actually have a chance to start developing. So yeah, this dev container is where a lot of the fun happens. We do some work to make sure that everything is pointing to the local version of the installed .NET. So yeah, if you have your own repo where you're thinking about, oh, I want to set up dev containers for my repo, do take a look at our setup. It might be helpful to you. It's not too far from the generic recommended setup for .NET applications on CodeSpaces, but there's some helpful tidbits in there.
Cool.
Yeah.
Fowler,
Can I talk about
what's your
.NET
flow?
grep app?
What was that?
Oh, I was going to share something that I think is helpful for people who are contributing or just curious. I don't know if people know about this. So Fowler is a member of the source.net team for life, correct? Yeah, source.net team. Boo.
Yay.
I personally am on a different cohort. There's this really fantastic tool called .net.grep.app. I can honestly say that day to day, I spend probably 60% of my time in this. And that's typically because if I've ever, run across like a method definition and I want to see, hey, how are other people, a method invocation. I want to see, hey, how are other people in all the .NET repos using this? For example, recently I was working on writing a set of analyzers for minimal APIs. And I was literally spending all day just looking up keywords on .NET grep. So let's do something like descendant nodes. And this, I picked a wrong one because I always spell it wrong. How do you spell descendant? Yes, there you go. It's super fast, which is really great. But you can do something like look up a method invocation. And now I could look through all of the tests, the code base in every repo under the .NET org and GitHub and see how people are using it. So if I kind of like need some inspiration on how to do stuff, or I just want to like check out how people are using things, this is where I like to go. It's a lot better than source.net. Sorry, David.
Yeah, right.
There's some interesting questions going on about what do you do when you need to change something in the .NET runtime in order to change something in ASP.NET Core, like build on top of it. As we said before, we have this whole system that we call CodeFlow, which is basically, and there's a back-end app internal website basically, that we can use to monitor the status of all the builds and like what the daily .NET installer, which you can get from github.com/.net/installer. If you want to get something more recent than the official preview release. It's supposed to be daily, but sometimes there are issues, right? Infrastructure issues or test issues, whatever it might be. It is a fairly complicated code flow, as you can imagine. It's a fairly large dependency tree, and we have a dedicated team, I think Fowler said before, that not only builds the tools to manage that, like everything in that eng folder, but also maintains the services and the Azure subscriptions and whatever else where all that stuff runs. But there obviously are cases where sometimes you want to tweak something in a dependency that isn't in ASP.NET Core in order to do something in ASP.NET Core. I've never done it myself. Fowler, I don't know how long it's been since you've done it, or Safia, when you last did that. But it's possible. Like, everything can be pointed at somewhere via MS Build.
Yeah.
It's really hard. I mean,
it is not.
So
It's so hard. We avoid doing it unless we really want to make sure something isn't broken before merging. Our typical thing is to check it into runtime and then have it flow, and then we test it in the PR.
Which means that you don't do things like branches. For example, it's not like you create a branch of runtime, build a feature, build it, and then consume the output of that branch over in a.
Right.
We just typically don't do that.
No.
It does make some things more difficult, perhaps, than they otherwise could be. But
like performance testing,
it's incredibly. It would be very complex and expensive, frankly, to set up the facilities to do that type of thing reliably on top of what we have already, which is incredibly complex and expensive as it is.
Safia, you were saying something just now?
Oh, no, I was going to share that if you are a new contributor, generally for the issues that we label help wanted, we try and make sure that they don't put you in a situation where you do have to run, like do all sorts of craziness. There are ways where you can, for example, maybe you want to try how things are going to work with a different version of the Roslyn APIs or a different version of an external dependency. There is not documentation on how to do that. There is a way, and I will write the docs for it. Yes, generally.
Go on.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, generally, you'll have to work with other dependencies, but I don't think I've ever had to change something in runtime and validate it. Maybe once while I was working in Blazor debugging, but yeah.
I know there are folks in the community who do it. I know Ben Adams has done it. I think Nick Craver's done it. And if you're set up to build .NET runtime locally and ASP.NET Core, I don't want to use the word.
It's still hard.
It's hard. You have to, and our benchmarks do this as well. They have the capability to run, specify the version of the runtime separately to the version of ASP.NET Core, mostly so that we can find regressions and we can identify whether it was a runtime build that caused it. Ultimately, a .NET app is just a folder full of assemblies, and generally, one or two config files that might point at another folder full of assemblies. That's at its most simple case, and so you can hack things pretty, if you know where to change stuff, to tell any given app, hey, I want you to load the .NET runtime from over here, and I want you to run, load the ASP.NET Core runtime from over there. That's all doable. It's just
really hard,
straightforward. And as Nick's saying right now, I'd say it's harder to update your local build setup than to set it up initially, oddly enough. Yeah, I believe that.
Yep.
So
let me show my setup before we bail in 5 minutes. I'll show you my typical flow when I dev. So I'm in, is my thing showing now? Is it there?
Yep.
So I am in the release 6.0 branch because apparently 7.0 doesn't show up in VS yet. I thought it would, but it doesn't yet. I actually installed the 7.0 MSI last night, but it didn't show up at 7.0 for some reason. Who knows why? I think I installed it. Let me check before
I'm not sure that we've done the full brand, what we call branding.
We haven't changed it yet.
Everywhere.
I see.
Right, so 7.0 is way in the future. It is main though, but I don't think we've finished the end-to-end.
Yeah,
version.
see, I installed it. Okay, not working in VS yet. So typically, I would run restore CMD, and I have these kind of baked in from a long time ago before we detected Java and detected Node and skipped them. I have those two things installed, but I don't ever, for the most part, I don't work super often with JavaScript or Java. So I kind of skip those in my typical restore command. So I'll run restore CMD, I'll skip Java and Node, and typically native too. If I haven't built it in a while, I'll skip the C++, the Java, and the Node.js for a fast restore.
Can you zoom your terminal a bit, please?
With this, is that good?
One more. There we go.
Massive. All right, so I'll do a restore CMD with this in the root. That'll run, and then I will find the thing I want to work on. So let's say I'm working on Kestrel, just servers. Oh my gosh, the navigation is slow. See that? Kestrel. Every subfolder, not every subfolder has a start vs.cmd, and we have this thing called a solution filter that'll give you a solution file for just that subset of your repository. So you can, after working on Kestrel, it'll give me Kestrel and its dependencies, working on hosting, et cetera, the higher you go in the stack, the more things that gets pulled in, and you almost pull in the whole solution if you pull in like a Blazor or templates or an MVC, right? If you work low in the stack, you typically only pull in the things that it requires, which is just a small subset of things.
I'm going to open ASP.NET Core.sln on my machine just while you're talking.
It's going to take a day. I won't even try to open this thing because I'm streaming, but StarVS will launch the solution filter with the right .NET version that I restored locally, so I can work on this one part of the project, right? And then I typically will build. Actually, funny. I typically will build on the command line, like one DLL. And the tricky thing here is when you're trying to dev and run tests, it's fine to run it in the ASP.NET Core repository. But if I'm trying to actually test a new API or test something in an application, I will spin up a real application separately and then reference DLLs from my build in ASP.NET Core in the main app so I can test things that aren't in the repo. And it's kind of a mismatch between using an official build and using bits that I built myself. But it kind of gives you a better idea of what the end-to-end would look like when you're not actually in the repo itself, right?
Finished opening, by the way.
It did?
Mm.
No, you made it open, but it isn't working yet.
It's open and it's working. It's so done. VS started syncing the theme for VS because I had no.
Do you have IntelliSense? Do you have like the restore finish?
Everything, yeah. Like all the background stuff is done.
He's already made a commit. He's got
I call fake news. My machine is nuts. So yeah, that is my typical workflow: restore, build, use bits in a real project, and then test APIs that way.
How do you make it use it in a real project?
I do old school reference. So I don't copy. I actually reference them in place.
Reference.
Can you show that? Can you show that? Because it's obviously quite not at all idiomatic now with how .NET works, right? Yeah. But
it still works, and it's funny. There's no UI for it in VS. So it's all MS Build Group. So assume I had an artifact. I do have an artifact here. Let's say built like.
And this will have to be our dramatic conclusion for this show.
Yes.
We are done. Type next. So I would do this. Grab this folder in my project. VS is like struggling to open now. It's like, why are you streaming, David?
You've talked about this for years, Damian. There should be a setting where like Windows is like, don't install updates.
No, not in this case. This is just Fowler refusing to buy a new machine.
Okay.
This machine is awesome. Play do.
Wow. Okay, and that will just magically override.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it'll use whatever build I have as a baseline. So I always make sure I have a baseline installed that matches whatever the core repo roughly is using. Okay. So right now, if I'm running RTM, I'll install the RTM build. If I'm doing RC2 or 7.0, I install that build, and then I would grab those changes and apply my diff on top.
Okay, we got to wrap an hour. The VS Toolbox team is going to come for us.
All right.
They're starting a really cool show, which I hope people stick around for. It's at live.net, and they're going to be showing all the things, Mads Christensen, Leslie Richardson, and the whole VS team, all of them. Thousands of people now, but lots of people are going to be showing off all these cool new features. So stick around for that. This was awesome. This was really useful. I am going to play with CodeSpaces, especially. That looks really neat. So, all right. Fun. Thanks, everybody. Lots of fun here. Let's remove this so we can wave. Goodbye. Woo.
Bye, folks.
Dramatic zoom out.